and inflation is taxation on Americans. And under this administration, the inflation rates are something we haven't seen in decades. Now, I want to talk briefly about the Women's Health Protection Act, also known as abortion on demand. Later this week, House Democrats will bring to the floor the Women's Health Protection Act. I'll be voting no, along with many of my Republican colleagues. The legislation overrides past and future pro-life laws, both at the federal and the state level. If signed into law, it would create a national standard to allow for abortions for any reason at any stage of pregnancy, up to birth, without accountability for abortion providers or protections for women. Americans do not support abortion with no limits. As a matter of fact, 80% of Americans say abortion should be illegal after the third trimester, in the third trimester. Instead of allowing states to enact common sense legislation on the local level, this act would strip state lawmakers that power and create a national standard of unrestricted abortion. As a former state legislator myself in Oklahoma, I stood with my state Senate colleagues to protect the lives of the unborn, and I will stand to continue to do so in Washington. I'll also defend the sanctity of life and protecting American taxpayers from using our taxpayer dollars for these on-demand abortions. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the congressman, one of the congressmen from the great state of Wisconsin, home of the Badgers, Mike Gallagher.
As well as the now victorious Green Bay Packers. Today, the president is going to speak to the UN. This is a very high-stakes speech, particularly since across the world, questions are being asked about the nature of American leadership and the credibility of America's commitments. Our allies are openly questioning our resolve, and our enemies are looking for opportunities to test our resolve and exploit the growing vacuum of leadership as a result of this administration's disastrous decisions and incompetent execution of its surrender in Afghanistan. We have 13 American servicemen who are dead as a result of a suicide attack carried out by a terrorist who just days before was released by the Taliban. This is our new security partner. The Biden administration's security partner released a suicide bomber after he had spent 4 years in prison at Bagram, the very air base that this administration abandoned in the middle of the night without telling any of our allies about it. And now we have 13 servicemen and women who will never go home to their families. And we have 13 tragedies that we all have to deal with. We have 10 Afghan civilians that were killed as a result of a strike that was based on faulty intelligence. And I believe part of this administration's desire just to save face and look tough as the disaster got worse. 7 of those 10 were children, innocent children in Afghanistan that were killed. And of course, we now have hundreds, if not more, Americans that are effectively being held hostage by the Taliban, trapped behind enemy lines because we abandoned them. We left Americans behind. And we had an opportunity here in Congress to do something about it prior to August 31st, but the Speaker chose not to allow my bill to move forward, which would have required a plan to get Americans out of the country. When we then the next week came here, the veteran members of the Republican caucus came, even though we weren't in session, we came to the House floor, we asked for recognition for a revised version of this bill that simply said, give us a plan on how we're going to get Americans out, give us a list of all the equipment we left behind, give us a full accounting of any secret deals with the Taliban, make sure you're not going to recognize the Taliban, don't provide ransom payments to the Taliban, all bipartisan things. The Speaker gavelled that bill down. Congress, because of Speaker Pelosi, is missing in action from doing basic oversight of the biggest foreign policy disaster of our lifetimes. Because the Democratic caucus is sacrificing everything to the altar of Bernie Sanders' socialist spending spree. That's why they opposed my bill originally. We had to pass the $5 trillion spending framework. This is absolute insanity. I'm telling you as someone who has devoted my life to the defense of this country, who talks every day with allies in other countries, this is an extremely dangerous moment for U.S. national security, and we have to do something to fix this problem before it gets worse. Because right now, America looks weak on the world stage, and as we know from history, weakness invites aggression. We can only achieve peace through strength. We need to project strength. And with that, I believe I'm introducing my friend, even though the Saints beat the Packers in week 1. But I believe you lost a bet to me last year. But my friend Steve Scalise. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for your service to our country and your passion at trying to help those Americans that were stranded behind enemy lines by President Biden and his foreign policy team. If you look at all of the crises that we've seen in these last few months since President Biden took office, it's been one thing after the other that have been self-imposed, self-created. On day one, President Biden killed the Keystone Pipeline, destroyed thousands of American jobs, and then turns around weeks later and approves a Russian pipeline. So he kills jobs in America and Canada and creates jobs in Russia, weakens America's energy security. It's one of the reasons that we're seeing dramatic price increases at the pump that families are paying. Then you look at what he did at the border. Day one, stops completion of the wall that President Trump was building that was actually working, gets rid of the Remain in Mexico policy, which had stopped the flow of illegals coming into our country by the thousands. And President Trump had already worked out negotiations with the Northern Triangle countries. President Biden got rid of all of those, and now we're seeing a massive crisis, an uncontrolled crisis at our southern border. And it's important for a number of reasons, but when you think about the national security implications, after the debacle of President Biden's actions over in Afghanistan, he turned over a country to a terrorist organization. And as a terrorist organization now has not only a training ground, but a country that they're in charge of with over $85 billion of the world's most technologically advanced military equipment, according to reports, which, by the way, the Biden administration has not refuted. And you see the list of some of the things that President Biden gave to a terrorist organization, from C-130s to night vision goggles to some of the most advanced military equipment. Then you go and look at the fact that we've actually captured people on the terrorist watch list coming across our southern border. These aren't just people coming from Central and South American countries. It's people coming from European, Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries. How many more terrorists are going to be trying to come across our open southern border until President Biden steps up and does his job at keeping Americans safe? He's failed to do it. And so what is his answer this week and next week? As you see an inflation crisis, that's probably the biggest concern most Americans are expressing today, that they're paying more money for everything they're buying, from gasoline to food at the grocery store, waiting months to get a microwave oven if they're trying to upgrade their kitchen. He's now going to bring a massive tax hike bill, a $5 trillion tax and spend bill, all masquerading as an infrastructure bill. People get that will only increase inflation even more. And who's going to get hit the hardest? It's going to be hardworking families. It's going to be the lower income families. You know, we had a number of markups. 12 different committees last week had this package of bills come before the committee, over 160 hours of debate. Probably close to 100 amendments brought forward to try to get rid of these taxes that'll hurt families. One of them was the natural gas tax. President Biden is trying to raise over $60 billion of new taxes on natural gas. Now, I know during the campaign he promised people that if they made under $400,000, they wouldn't pay a dime in new taxes. The only problem is President Biden breaks that promise to the American people with this bill, because anybody that heats their home in the winter or cools their home in the summer with natural gas is going to pay more. Conservative estimates say over 12% increase in people's household electricity bills because of President Biden's new tax increase on natural gas. And when we tried to take that out and point it out to Democrats that it would break President Biden's promise, they voted on a party line vote to keep that tax there, to keep taxing families with this new tax. And there's a whole lot of other taxes that low-income families will pay as well. By the way, we tried to exempt hospitals from the tax, because you know what? Hospitals will now have to pay more which means they're going to lead to higher health care costs. President Biden also promised he wouldn't raise health care costs. That promise will be broken too. What we see is a failure of leadership and a series of broken promises. And this week, not only are they going to start that process of raising taxes that hardworking families will pay. In fact, many people making less than $100,000 a year will pay more in new taxes under this Biden tax increase plan, but it will absolutely boost inflation even higher. Inflation, by the way, which is the biggest new tax on low-income families, that is already dramatically higher, 20-30% higher for families, is going to get even higher if the federal government taxes and spends another $5 trillion. These are insurmountable debts that families cannot afford and shouldn't have to afford. And we on the Republican side are continue to stand up for working families and fight against these radical policies, not only on the tax and spend side, not only trying to get our southern border under control, but to defend innocent life, which this administration, as they try to push abortion on demand, as Stephanie Bice just talked about, are trying to appease the most radical, far-left elements of their base instead of working for all of the American people. Again, one more broken promise by President Biden. He said he'd work with everybody, those who voted with him and those who voted against him. He's yet to follow through on that promise. So as we look at all these broken promises, we're going to continue fighting for those hardworking families on the Republican side. With that, we'll be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Excuse me, Whit. You talked about the Women's Health Protection Act and abortion on demand. I wanted to talk about the $3.5 trillion or $5.5 trillion and what it's going to be. That has no Hyde Amendment protections. That has no Holmes Amendment protections. That has no Smith Amendment protections. Your reaction to that?
It's really appalling that President Biden is trying to abandon over 40 years of bipartisan work, going back to when Henry Hyde finally got a Democrat majority Congress to agree that taxpayer funds should not be used to fund abortion. By the way, since Hyde protections were in place, tens of millions of babies have been saved. They are trying to take that away. They're trying to gut Hyde, and we're not going to let it happen. We had an amendment, Captain McMorris Rogers, our lead Republican on Energy and Commerce Committee, brought an amendment back up to restore Hyde protections, to say we've always agreed in a bipartisan way that taxpayer funds shouldn't be used for abortion, and on a party line vote, they voted it down. The Democrat Party just 10, 20 years ago, you would have had 40 Democrats voting for an amendment like that. Today, not a single Democrat's willing to stand up for innocent life. It's a sad testament to just how far to the radical left the Democrat Party has shifted.
GOP leaders are whipping against the CR debt ceiling hike disaster package, which would benefit, Louisiana, which state you both represent. Why are Republicans comfortable opposing this package, especially after agreeing to raise the debt ceiling multiple times under President Donald Trump?
Well, if you notice, the debt that they've incurred just this year alone to fund things like bailing out failed states, paying people not to work, and then ultimately now to pass this $5+ trillion tax and spend bill. We're not the only ones against it. Most American people don't want this level of spending and taxes that are going to increase inflation even higher. So we're against that. If the Democrats want to bring bad policies like that, they're the ones that are going to have to answer for it. They shouldn't try to tie it, by the way, to a bill that funds basic needs of government. And the Senate's made it clear they're not going to go for this. This is a 60-vote issue in the Senate, and they don't have 60 votes. So the bill that the Speaker Pelosi is bringing through this week will not become law. They're going to have to go back to the drawing board. They might have to go to reconciliation to address the debt ceiling, which, by the way, right now they're just trying to put a date so you don't know the full amount that they're trying to increase the debt ceiling. Shouldn't we know that number? If Democrats are going to add trillions of additional debt that our kids will have to pay, shouldn't they at least put that number out there? In a reconciliation bill, they would actually have to list the number. So I think you're going to see this change dramatically if it passes in the House. And I'll tell you, you can already see they don't have the votes for their tax and spend bill masquerading as an infrastructure package, because you see some of the far left saying they're not going to vote for infrastructure until they get the taxes. And then you get the liberal members who are in swing districts saying they won't vote for the taxes unless they get the infrastructure. So there's a lot of game left to be played.
Congressman Gallagher just brought up recently the push for there to be a review in Afghanistan about the weapons being left behind. The CR text that was just released includes the review. Do you see that as an encouraging sign? I know that you're working against it, but does that have any influence in how you feel about the decision?
Well, the Biden administration ought to come clean to the country just what he left behind and gave a terrorist organization, the Taliban. When he abandoned Afghanistan without a plan to get our Americans out who were stranded behind enemy lines, number one, he should have never left until he first got out every American. Anybody with common sense knows that. Our allies around the world are livid because he didn't just leave Americans stranded behind enemy lines. He left friends from other countries behind enemy lines too, without telling our allies. Then when you look at some of the other proposals that he has, shouldn't he be transparent? Again, President Biden promised he would be transparent, yet when he's been asked, can you give us an accounting of all of the military assets that you left behind to have the Taliban take over? We've heard reports that they're pallets of cash.
That's what the CR says.
And so, no, the NDAA actually says that. So that language is in the NDAA. But ultimately, President Biden should come clean on his own. He should be telling the press, he should be telling the American people what he gave to a terrorist organization. You know, if he's ashamed of that amount of money, which he should be, then he should have never let them have it. He knew when he was going to pull out. Shouldn't he have at least taken the C-130s? You could have loaded a C-130 up with all of that military equipment, the night vision goggles, the artillery. He didn't do that. And he owes the American people an explanation and a full accounting of what he gave the Taliban.
Last question. I have a
Mr.
foreign
Scalise,
relations
to follow
question.
up on Melanie's question, do you support the $30 billion that Democrats have set aside for disaster relief for your state of Louisiana and other states that were impacted by the hurricane Ida?
Yeah, and you know, this goes back to Hurricane Laura of last year. We were pushing the Office of Management and Budget to come out with a supplemental request. We urged them to do that. We wanted that to be a standalone bill, and I think in the end it will be separated from this package. Before it's all said and done, I think by the end of next week, you will see that removed from this debt ceiling increase bill. And again, they don't have the votes in the Senate to tie all this to a single package. So this is early in this process. We'll ultimately get another chance to vote on that when it comes back from the Senate in a much different way than it's going to leave the House in a partisan fashion.
I'm wondering about the United the UN. So the head of the UN just warned about a Cold War between the U.S. and China. Considering the fundamental difference on human rights abuses and other things, what's your response to that nudge to kind of repair relations? And is there a way to move forward with China while at the same time holding them accountable for the violence?
Yeah, and I'll ask Mr. Gallagher to follow up. But look, we've been pushing for over a year now to have a basic hearing into the origins of COVID-19. President Trump was starting to stand up to China before COVID, just in the way that they don't follow the rules of the game on trade, on intellectual property. Those are things that had been a problem before COVID. It's even more of a problem now. President Biden has shown no willingness to stand up to China, and frankly, I'm sure Mr. Gallagher can talk more about it, but frankly, you know, we've got to stand up for America and our allies all around the world, and if China wants to try to play by a different set of rules, they've got to recognize that to be part of the world community, you've got to play by the rules that everyone else has to participate in.
Just briefly add, I mean, it's my view that we are in the early stages of a new Cold War with China. What makes it different than the old Cold War is, one, we're thoroughly economically entangled with China, and I think our big lesson learned from the pandemic is that we can't be critically dependent on a hostile foreign adversary for the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, basic critical technology. And so there's a lot of people in Wall Street and Hollywood that need to wake up and realize that there are more important things than making a profit in China. Because in doing that, you're making a profit off slave labor. And if China wants a better relationship with the United States, we welcome it, but it's in their control. They can not threaten to invade Taiwan. They can not commit a genocide, which is the considered judgment of the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and they can stop going around the world coercing everyone that has the temerity to question their human rights abuses. I would say there's one final thing that gives me pause about this new Cold War and what's different than the old is that there doesn't seem to be a consensus here in the United States that we deserve to win. Because we have a crazy woke ideology that's teaching a whole generation of Americans that America is an evil, racist hellscape that must constantly apologize for its past sins and be scared of its own shadow. That's unacceptable. And the Chinese Communist Party officials are co-opting that narrative of the far left so that they can lecture our officials when they sit across from them in Alaska and say, you can't criticize us about Tiananmen or Xinjiang because America's evil. You're just as bad as us. That's unacceptable. This is the greatest country in the history of the world, and until we recognize that fact and understand it, we're going to be playing catch-up in this new Cold War for a long time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.